In this section, we will be learning about all the functionalities and options that we have in the render setup window. And in this lesson particularly, we'll be discussing color mapping. In the render setup window and under V-Ray tab, you can find the color mapping rollout. And probably we should have discussed color mapping in the global illumination or image sampling section of the course, but I've decided to unify all of the render setup settings in one section. So what is color mapping? Basically, color mapping is an internal process that maps the colors rendered by the render engine to a range that is visible by human eyes and also in the monitor. It basically maps the low and high color values to a range that is visible and usable for us. In most render engines, this is hard-coded in the engine and we as user cannot adjust it. But in V-Ray, we can actually control all the aspects of the color mapping process in the color mapping rollout. So let's see what do we have here. For now, let's set the interface to expert so we can see all the parameters and options. First, in the type dropdown, we can control the overall color mapping mode that will be used. We have linear multiply, exponential, HSV exponential, intensity exponential, gamma correction, intensity gamma, and Reinhardt. Let's start from linear multiply and see how it performs the color mapping as we take a look at the render performed with this color mapping. Linear multiply simply multiplies the final image colors based on their brightness without applying any other changes. And as you can see from the render, this color mapping clamps bright colors to white and causes the bright parts of the image to look burnt out or overexposed. So in this mode, each pixel is gonna be multiplied by its brightness, and that's why we get a very vivid and bright image. However, because of this linear nature, we get overexposed and extremely bright and burnt out areas in the render. Next, we have exponential color mapping. Exponential saturates the colors based on their brightness, and this can be useful in preventing burnouts in very bright areas. But you can see the final image looks desaturated and less vivid compared to the linear multiply color mapping. But we have no burnt out and overexposed parts in the image, which is great. Exponential color mapping is especially useful in interior visualizations. HSV exponential is similar to exponential, but preserves the color hue and saturation instead of washing out the color towards the white. And it tries to solve the dullness and desaturated colors produced in the exponential color mapping, but trying to preserve the color saturation in bright areas that in real world tend to get closer to a white color doesn't produce a pleasant image, honestly. We have intensity exponential, which is similar to exponential but preserves the ratio of the RGB color components and will only affect the intensity of the colors. Gamma correction and intensity gamma are here for legacy purposes, for when there wasn't a gamma correction option available for all the color mapping types. And we have Reinhardt color mapping, which is the default option and the most powerful color mapping type. Reinhardt is a blend between exponential and linear multiply. Basically a hybrid algorithm that combines both linear and exponential color mapping. The degree to which one method or the other is applied to the image is specified by the burn value parameter. So if the burn value is set to 1, linear multiply will be used, and if set to 0, exponential will be used. And any in-between values will combine the two, obviously. Now let's take a look at a few renders with the Reinhardt color mapping and different burn values. In the first render, burn value was set to 0, so we are basically using exponential color mapping. In the next render, burn value was set to 0.15, then 0.25. Now we are using a combination of exponential and linear multiply color mapping. But because burn value is closer to 0, exponential color mapping is still the dominant one. In the next render, burn value was set to 0.5. Now both exponential and linear color mapping contributing half and half. And finally, burn value was set to 1, which is the same as linear multiply color mapping. For now, let's set the burn value to 0.15. Another parameter available in the Reinhardt type is multiplier, and this is a general multiplier for the color before they are corrected, and basically an overall brightness control for the entire image. In the first render, multiplier was set to 0.01, so we get a very dark image. And in the next render, multiplier was set to 1, which is our normal render, and in the next one it was set to 2, and we get an overall brighter image. Let's set the multiplier to 1 for now. In the linear exponential, HSV exponential, and intensity exponential, we have two parameters named dark and bright multiplier. The dark multiplier specifies the multiplier applied to the dark color values, and bright multiplier specifies the multiplier applied to the bright color values. For now, let's change the type to linear and set the bright multiplier back to its default value of 1 and take a look at a few renders. In the first render, bright multiplier was 1, the next one was 0.75, then 0.5, then 0.25. You can see it takes the bright pixels of the image, and each time we decrease the bright multiplier, those bright pixels become darker, but the darker pixels stay unchanged. And if we set the bright multiplier to be more than 1, those bright pixels even get brighter. Let's set the bright multiplier to 1 for now. As I said, dark multiplier specifies the multiplier applied to dark color values. In the first render, dark multiplier was 1, then 0.5, and finally 0.2. As you can see, the engine takes the darker pixels and multiply them by this value, and each time we decrease dark multiplier, those pixels become darker and darker, and if we use a dark multiplier higher than 1, those dark pixels get brighter. For now, let's set the dark multiplier to 1. Next we have gamma, and if I quote V-Ray's guide, it controls the gamma correction for the output image regardless of the color mapping mode. For example, to correct the image for a 2.2 gamma display, set this parameter to 2.2. Subpixel mapping specifies where the color mapping is going to be applied, whether at the pixel level or if you enable subpixel mapping at the subpixel level, and to get more correct result, it's recommended to have this option off. We have clamp output, which clips or clamps the very bright and high values, and the clamp value here specifies level of the cutoff of the information by the clamp output. And if you don't need that very dynamic range of information, or there is an artifact produced by the image sampling, for example, you can clamp the values, but generally it's a good idea to have those high dynamic range information and leaving clamp output disabled. In the first render, clamp output is off. In the next render, it was on and set to 1. And even though the image looks the same as our previous render, which was a clamp output off in it, if I right click on this very bright spot, you can see the float values are not exceeding 1 in the brightest parts of the image. But in the previous image with clamp output off, we get very high values like 4, 6, even 11. Even though our monitor cannot display those ranges, but in the render with clamp output set to 1, we have limited the range from 0 to 1. And in the final render, clamp output was set to 0.5. Now let's set the clamp output to 1 and turn it off completely. Also, let's set the color mapping to Reinhardt and burn value to 0.15. We have effect background, so whether the color mapping affects background colors or not. In this case, the background is the V-Ray sky in the environment slot. We have mode options, and let me quote V-Ray's guide for this and go through the renders for each mode. as I explained them. Here mode basically specifies if color mapping and gamma are burned into the final image. This option replaces the don't affect colors adaptation only parameters from previous V-Ray versions. Color mapping only, no gamma. Only color mapping is burned into the final image and not gamma correction. This is the default option. V-Ray will still proceed to sample the image as though both color mapping and gamma are applied, but will only apply the color correction to the final result. Color mapping and gamma, in this mode both color mapping and gamma are burned into the final image. This corresponds to don't affect color parameters set to disabled in previous V-Ray versions, and we have none or don't apply anything. Basically neither color mapping nor gamma are burned into the final image. However, V-Ray will proceed with all its calculations as though color mapping and gamma are applied. This can be useful, for example, if you know that you will apply some color correction to the image later on but wish to keep the rendering itself in linear space for compositing purposes. This corresponds to don't affect colors parameters set to enabled in previous V-Ray versions. Okay, so that's about modes. And finally we have linear workflow, and this one is a legacy option as well, and both 3ds Max and V-Ray are by default set up with proper linear workflow in mind, and you don't need to enable this option at all. Perfect. So in this lesson we discussed color mapping, and I will see you in the next lesson.